Your kind never knows how to behave in a courtroom. Judge Robert Clarkson's voice thundered across the room, his face twisted in disgust. What are you even doing here? You're lucky I'm not throwing you out. The entire courtroom went silent. All eyes were on the young black woman standing at the defendant's table. She was dressed neatly, her long braids falling over her shoulders, her hands calmly folded in front of her. But there was something in her expression, something that didn't match the humiliation the judge expected her to feel. She didn't shrink. She didn't tremble. Instead, she looked at him with quiet confidence, her lips pressed together, her brown eyes steady. For a moment, the judge hesitated. Something about the way she stood unsettled him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He smirked and leaned forward. Well, nothing to say. Not surprising. People like you always have an attitude, but when it's time to speak with intelligence, you go silent. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The woman let out a small sigh. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a sleek black badge, and held it up for the entire room to see. The judge's smirk faded. The badge gleamed under the courtroom lights, but it wasn't just any badge. It was a special investigator's badge from the State Judicial Committee. And at that moment, Judge Clarkson realized his mistake. She wasn't a defendant. She was an undercover attorney, sent to investigate him. The judge's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The courtroom remained deathly silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then the woman spoke. Her voice was calm, firm. I do have something to say, Your Honor. And just like that, the entire courtroom was turned upside down. It had started 3 weeks earlier. Danielle Turner had always believed in justice. As a young attorney, she worked hard, determined to change the legal system from within. But it wasn't easy. She had seen too many people like her, people of color, people from poor backgrounds, treated unfairly in courtrooms across the country. So when the State Judicial Committee approached her with a special assignment, she knew she couldn't say no. The mission? To go undercover and investigate reports of discrimination and misconduct by Judge Robert Clarkson. Danielle had heard of him before. A powerful man, feared by many, known for making harsh rulings, especially against Black and Latino defendants. There were rumors that he deliberately sentenced people unfairly, but there was no solid proof. Her job was to get that proof. So she transformed herself into someone else. She dressed down, kept her hair in simple braids, and removed any trace of her professional background from public records. She posed as a struggling law student caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, assigned a court-appointed attorney who barely paid attention to her case. And then, the moment she had been waiting for arrived. She was scheduled to appear in Judge Clarkson's courtroom. From the second she walked in, she could feel the weight of judgment on her. The way the bailiff barely looked at her, the way the clerk's smile faded the moment he saw her skin color. And when the judge finally looked at her, she saw it in his eyes, the dismissal, the prejudice, the silent decision that she was less than. But Danielle knew how to play the part. She kept her head down, let them assume she was nervous. Then the hearing began. Judge Clarkson barely looked at the case files before sneering at her. So, Miss Turner, I suppose you don't have a real defense. You people never do. There was a small gasp in the room, but no one dared to challenge him. Danielle could feel her heart pounding, but she remained still. She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was what came next. The judge leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Tell me, Miss Turner, do you even understand how a courtroom works? Or did you just come here hoping to cry your way out of this? Danielle felt her fingers tighten into fists at her sides. The words stung, not because they surprised her, but because she had seen this happen too many times. To others. To people who didn't have the power to fight back. But she did. She had waited for the right moment, and now it was time. With a slow, steady movement, she reached into her pocket. The judge kept talking, his voice dripping with arrogance, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Then, she pulled out the badge. The room went still. Everything changed in an instant. And now, the question hung in the air like a storm cloud about to break. What was going to happen next? The courtroom remained frozen in shock. Danielle let the silence drag out, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. The judge's face twitched. His eyes darted around, looking for support, but none of his usual allies dared to speak. The attorneys, the jury, the audience, they all sat there, stunned, waiting to see what would happen. Danielle took a slow step forward. Your Honor, she said again, her voice still calm, still steady. Would you like me to repeat myself? The judge's lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked down at the badge again. The realization hit him like a truck. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't a joke. This was an investigation. And he had just exposed himself in front of an entire courtroom. Danielle could see it in his eyes, the panic, the struggle to regain control. Then, as if flipping a switch, he forced a smile and let out a small, forced chuckle. Well, he said, his voice cracking slightly. This is quite unexpected. Danielle didn't move. Is it? The judge's smile faltered. The entire courtroom was waiting. The tension grew heavier, pressing down on the air like a vice. Judge Clarkson shifted in his seat. I'm not sure what game you're playing, young lady, but this is highly unprofessional. Danielle's lips curled into the smallest hint of a smile. Oh, I assure you, Your Honor, she said, I take my job very seriously. And just like that, the entire balance of power in the room shifted. Judge Clarkson, a man who had humiliated countless people in his courtroom, was now the one on trial. And he knew it. But this was just the beginning. Because what Danielle didn't know yet was that Judge Clarkson wasn't going down without a fight. For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, Judge Clarkson cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. His grip on the wooden bench tightened. He had ruled this courtroom for years. His word was law. But now, the power was slipping from his fingers, and he knew it. Danielle could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. He wasn't going to back down easily. Young lady, he began, forcing a smile. I'm not sure what kind of stunt you think you're pulling, but I have an actual case to handle. I suggest you sit down and let the court-appointed attorney do their job. Danielle didn't move. I think we both know this isn't just another case, Your Honor. The judge's smile twitched. She could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath. No one had ever spoken to Judge Clarkson like this before. And it wasn't just her words. It was the certainty in her voice. The way she stood tall. The way she wasn't intimidated by him. Not even a little bit. Clarkson leaned forward. And what exactly do you think is going on here? Danielle held up the badge again. I'm here as an investigator from the State Judicial Committee. I was sent to observe how you conduct your courtroom. She paused. So far, it hasn't been pretty. A ripple went through the courtroom. The judge's face darkened. But before he could speak, a sudden loud bang echoed across the room. The courtroom doors burst open. A tall man in a dark gray suit strode inside, his face unreadable. Danielle recognized him immediately. Charles Whitman, head of the State Judicial Committee. Her boss. The judge's face paled. This was no longer just a courtroom hearing. It was a reckoning. 3 weeks earlier, when Danielle had first been given this case, she had known it would be dangerous. Judge Clarkson was powerful, with friends in high places. Taking him down wouldn't be easy. But she had no idea just how deep his corruption ran. The first red flag appeared the moment she began researching him. She found case after case of questionable rulings. Young black men sentenced to maximum prison time for minor offenses. Single mothers losing custody of their children without clear reasons. People from low-income neighborhoods given impossibly high bail amounts while wealthier defendants walked free. The patterns were obvious. Yet, somehow, Clarkson had avoided any real consequences for years. The few lawyers who had tried to report him had mysteriously backed down. Some even disappeared from the legal scene altogether. Danielle knew that meant one thing. Clarkson had influence. The kind of influence that could destroy careers. So, she decided to take a different approach. Instead of gathering secondhand evidence, she would go undercover. She would experience his courtroom firsthand. That was why she had posed as a defendant, carefully planting herself in the perfect position to expose his corruption. And now, standing in front of him, she could see the moment he realized just how badly he had messed up. Clarkson clenched his jaw. His usual arrogance wavered, but only for a second. Then, just like that, he was back in control, or at least, he wanted everyone to believe he was. I don't appreciate being ambushed in my own courtroom, he snapped. If the State Judicial Committee has concerns, there are proper channels. Those channels haven't worked for years, Charles Whitman interrupted, his voice cool and sharp. That's why we sent her. Clarkson's eyes flickered between Whitman and Danielle. For the first time, the panic was real. This wasn't just some young woman playing a trick on him. This was an official investigation, and he was at the center of it. Danielle didn't break eye contact. Shall we continue the hearing, Your Honor? She asked, her voice laced with quiet challenge. The judge's nostrils flared. Then, without warning, he slammed his gavel down. This court is adjourned, he barked. The tension in the room exploded. Gasps filled the air. Lawyers murmured to each other. The bailiff hesitated, unsure what to do. But Danielle? She just smiled. Because she had been expecting this. Judge Clarkson wasn't going to let this play out fairly. He was going to fight back. But what he didn't know was that she was ready for it. And the real battle had just begun. Later that night, Danielle sat in her small apartment, flipping through stacks of case files. She wasn't done. Not even close. She had exposed Clarkson, but now, she needed to make sure he paid for what he had done. She sipped her tea and studied an old newspaper article. It was about a young man named Jamal Rivers, a college student, arrested for a crime he swore he didn't commit. Clarkson had sentenced him to 20 years in prison. No evidence. No fair trial. Just a decision made in under 10 minutes. Danielle clenched her jaw. Jamal's case was just one of hundreds. And if Clarkson thought he could walk away from this, he was dead wrong. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Whitman. Be careful. He's dangerous. Danielle exhaled slowly. She already knew that. But she wasn't scared. Clarkson might be powerful, but he wasn't untouchable. She would bring him down, no matter what it took. Just then, she heard a noise outside her window. A soft click, like someone unlocking a door. Her heart pounded. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she reached for her phone. But before she could dial a number, the lights went out. The entire apartment was plunged into darkness. And in that instant, Danielle realized. She wasn't alone. Danielle froze. The darkness pressed around her like a heavy blanket. Her fingers tightened around her phone, her breath shallow. The room was silent, except for the faint creak of a floorboard near the entrance. Someone's here. Her mind raced. Had Clarkson already sent someone after her? Slowly, she rose from her chair, keeping her movements light and careful. She reached for the baseball bat she kept tucked behind her bookshelf. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. A shadow shifted near the doorway. Danielle clenched the bat. Who's there? She called, keeping her voice steady. No answer. The air felt thick, tense. Then, a sudden rush of movement. Danielle swung the bat with all her strength. Crack. The bat struck something. No, someone. A sharp grunt filled the air as the figure stumbled back. Danielle didn't wait. She grabbed her phone and sprinted toward the front door, yanking it open. Just as she reached the hallway, she glanced back and saw him, a tall man in dark clothes, wearing a ski mask. Even in the dim light, she could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. Gun. Her stomach dropped. Without thinking, she slammed the door shut and bolted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The man recovered fast. She heard his heavy footsteps chasing after her. Danielle didn't stop. She burst out of the building and into the night, her breath fogging in the cool air. Her car was parked at the curb. If she could just... Bang! A gunshot rang out. Danielle ducked behind a parked car, her hands trembling. People in nearby apartments turned on their lights, peering out their windows. The attacker hesitated. He couldn't risk being seen. Danielle used that second to bolt toward her car. She jumped inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of the parking lot before he could fire again. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her pulse racing. That wasn't just a warning. Whoever that man was, he had come to kill her. 30 minutes later, Danielle sat in a secure building owned by the State Judicial Committee, her arms wrapped around herself. Whitman paced in front of her, his face grim. This is exactly what I was afraid of, he muttered. Clarkson's reach is bigger than we thought. Danielle took a deep breath, trying to calm the shaking in her hands. You think he sent that guy? Whitman's jaw clenched. I'd bet my career on it. Danielle swallowed hard. Then that means we're getting close. Whitman turned to her, his expression serious. Close is dangerous. This man has been untouchable for years. If he's desperate enough to send a hitman after you, then he's willing to do anything to keep his seat. Danielle met his eyes. Then we have to move faster. Whitman sighed, rubbing his temples. We have enough to make people question him, but not enough to take him down completely. We need something bigger. Something that proves his corruption beyond a doubt. Danielle exhaled slowly. She knew he was right, and she knew exactly where to start. Jamal Rivers. She needed to find him. Because if anyone could expose Clarkson, it was the man whose life he had destroyed. The next morning, Danielle sat in a small cafe, sipping a cup of coffee as she stared at the files in front of her. Jamal had been a promising student before his arrest, a straight-A college athlete with no criminal record. Then, one night, he had been accused of robbing a convenience store. No security footage, no physical evidence, just a shaky witness statement from a store clerk who thought it was him. Clarkson had sentenced him to 20 years without a second thought. Danielle clenched her jaw. There had to be more to the story. She had spent the morning making calls, pulling strings. Finally, she got a lead. Jamal's mother still lived in the same neighborhood. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. Danielle gathered her things and headed out, determined. But as she walked toward her car, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. A black SUV, parked across the street. She had seen it before. Last night, near her apartment. Her pulse quickened. They were watching her, following her. And if she wasn't careful, they wouldn't just be watching. They'd be waiting to strike. But Danielle didn't back down. Instead, she got into her car, started the engine, and drove toward Jamal's mother's house. Because now, more than ever, she needed to know the truth. And she needed to expose Clarkson before it was too late. Danielle kept her eyes on the rearview mirror as she drove. The black SUV followed. Not too close, not too far, just enough to let her know they were there. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She had expected Clarkson to fight back, but this was different. This wasn't intimidation. This was a warning, a silent message, back off, or else. But if they thought she would scare easily, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Danielle made a sharp right turn onto a quiet street, then another. The SUV stayed behind her. Her heart pounded. Then she spotted a police car parked ahead at a gas station. Without hesitation, she veered into the station lot and parked beside it. The SUV hesitated at the intersection. For a split second, it seemed like they might follow. But then, they drove past. Danielle let out a slow breath, watching as the SUV disappeared down the road. Not today. She wasn't naive enough to think they were gone for good. But for now, she had shaken them off. And she had somewhere important to be. She started the car again and continued toward Jamal Rivers' mother's house. 30 minutes later, she pulled up to a small brick home in a worn-down neighborhood. The house was tidy, but the paint was chipping. A wooden wind chime dangled from the porch, clinking softly in the breeze. Danielle took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened. An older woman stood there, wrapped in a light cardigan, her graying hair pulled back. Danielle recognized her immediately from the files. Angela Rivers, Jamal's mother. Her eyes were tired, as if she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for years. Danielle hesitated. Mrs. Rivers? Angela studied her carefully. Who's asking? My name is Danielle Turner. I'm an attorney. She paused, then added, and I believe your son was wrongfully convicted. The woman's lips parted slightly. A flicker of something, hope, crossed her face. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Angela exhaled and shook her head. You're not the first person to say that. Danielle stepped closer. But I am the first person who can actually do something about it. Silence. Then, Angela opened the door wider. Come in. Danielle followed her inside. The house smelled of vanilla and old books. A framed photo of Jamal sat on the coffee table. He was young in the picture, grinning at the camera, full of life. Seeing it made Danielle's chest tighten. Angela sat down in a chair and gestured for Danielle to do the same. I don't know how much you think you can do, Angela said quietly, but my son has been locked up for almost 5 years now. No one wants to listen. No one wants to help. Danielle leaned forward. I do. Angela studied her again, as if trying to see if she was telling the truth. Finally, she sighed. Jamal didn't rob that store, she said. He was with his friend that night, watching a basketball game. They never even left the house. Danielle nodded. I saw the case files. There was no real evidence, just a store clerk who said he thought it was Jamal. Angela's face twisted with anger. Thought, she scoffed. They didn't even bother investigating. Didn't check the alibi. Nothing. Danielle's heart ached for her. How did Clarkson treat him during the trial? She asked. Angela's lips pressed together, like he wasn't even a person. She shook her head, her voice shaking. That man, he looked at my son like he had already made up his mind before the trial even started. Like Jamal was just another number to him. Danielle had expected that, but hearing it still made her stomach churn. I want to reopen Jamal's case, Danielle said firmly. Angela's eyes widened. Danielle continued. If we can prove the trial was unfair, if we can find solid evidence of misconduct, we can get your son out. For the first time, a small glimmer of hope appeared in Angela's eyes. But then, she hesitated. They'll come after you, she warned. People have tried to fight Clarkson before. They either lose their jobs, or worse. Danielle thought about the black SUV, about the masked man in her apartment. She knew Angela was right, but she also knew she couldn't walk away. Let them try, she said. I'm not scared. Angela stared at her for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. And just like that, the fight to free Jamal Rivers had begun. That night, Danielle sat in her office, digging through case files. She needed more than just suspicions. She needed hard proof that Clarkson had railroaded Jamal. She was halfway through reading the trial transcripts when her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Stop now. This is your last warning. Danielle's blood went cold. She had expected threats. But this was different. Before she could react, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video message. With shaky fingers, she tapped the screen. The video loaded, and what she saw made her heart drop. It was a live feed of Angela Rivers' house. A man stood outside, watching, waiting. Danielle's hands shook as she gripped the phone. They weren't just coming for her. They were going after anyone who tried to help. She grabbed her car keys and ran out the door. Because one thing was clear. Angela Rivers was in danger. And if Danielle didn't stop them now, she might lose her only chance to bring Clarkson down. Danielle's tires screeched as she sped through the empty streets. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The video kept playing in her mind. Angela Rivers' house, the dark figure standing outside, watching. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a promise. A promise that if Danielle didn't stop digging, innocent people would pay the price. Not on my watch. She pulled up to Angela's house in record time, barely putting the car in park before jumping out. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows. Danielle scanned the area, heart pounding. No sign of the man from the video. But that didn't mean he was gone. Cautiously, she approached the front door and knocked. No answer. Her stomach twisted. She knocked again, louder this time. Mrs. Rivers? It's me, Danielle. Still nothing. A sick feeling spread through her. She reached for the doorknob and turned it. Unlocked. That was wrong. Angela wouldn't just leave her door open this late. Danielle took a slow breath and stepped inside. The house was dark, silent. The air was thick with tension. Her pulse raced. Mrs. Rivers? A creak sounded from the kitchen. Danielle's breath hitched. Someone was here. She grabbed her phone and moved carefully toward the noise, her fingers hovering over the emergency dial. She turned the corner and nearly screamed. Angela sat in a chair, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. And standing behind her, holding a knife against her throat, was a man in a ski mask. Danielle froze. The man's dark eyes locked onto hers. Put the phone down, he ordered, his voice low and rough. Danielle's mind raced. She was unarmed, outnumbered. If she moved too fast, he could hurt Angela. Slowly, she lowered her phone, but didn't drop it. Let her go. The man chuckled. Not how this works. Angela whimpered, her breath shaky. Danielle clenched her fists. You're making a mistake. The man tilted his head. No, you are. You should have walked away. His grip on the knife tightened. Danielle's heart pounded. Think. She had one shot at this. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted something. A glass vase on the counter, just within reach. She made her decision. With lightning speed, she grabbed the vase and hurled it at his face. Smash. The man let out a grunt, momentarily blinded. Angela jerked away, tumbling onto the floor. Danielle lunged forward, shoving the man with all her strength. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. Run! Danielle shouted. Angela scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the door. Danielle turned to follow. But before she could move, the man recovered. Something cold and hard slammed into the side of her head. Pain exploded through her skull. Her vision blurred. The world tilted. She hit the floor. The last thing she heard before darkness swallowed her. The man's voice, low and menacing. You should have stayed out of this. Then, nothing. When Danielle woke up, everything hurt. Her head throbbed. Her vision swam. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then it all came rushing back. The man. The knife. Angela. She forced her eyes open. She was still in the house, lying on the living room floor. The room was a mess. broken glass, overturned furniture. Angela was gone. Danielle's breath hitched. Had they taken her? She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her skull. She winced, pressing a hand to her temple. Her fingers came away sticky. Blood. Stay calm. She fumbled for her phone. It was still in her pocket. Hands shaking, she dialed Whitman's number. He picked up on the first ring. Danielle. Her voice was hoarse. They took Angela. A sharp inhale. Where are you? Her house. She swallowed hard. They were waiting for me. A pause. Then, I'm on my way. Stay put. Danielle exhaled shakily, gripping the phone. No, she couldn't stay put. Angela was in danger because of her, and she was going to get her back, with or without help. Danielle pushed herself up, ignoring the dizziness. She had a plan. She just hoped she wasn't too late. Meanwhile, in a dark warehouse on the outskirts of town, Angela Rivers sat tied to a chair, her hands bound, her breath shallow. The man in the ski mask stood in the shadows, watching her. His phone buzzed. He answered. A deep voice on the other end spoke. Is it done? The man glanced at Angela. She trembled, but held his gaze, fear mixed with defiance. He smirked. Not yet, he said. But soon. The voice on the other end exhaled. Good. Make sure she gets the message. Then, the line went dead. Angela closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. Because she knew. This wasn't just about silencing her. This was a message to Danielle. And if Danielle wasn't careful, she might be next. Danielle clenched the steering wheel, her head still throbbing from the blow she had taken. Blood had dried at her temple, and her hands trembled slightly, but she pushed through the pain. Angela was out there, somewhere, and Danielle wasn't going to let these people win. She had managed to grab one crucial piece of evidence before leaving Angela's house. A crumpled piece of paper that had fallen from the masked man's pocket during their struggle. A receipt. It was from a gas station on the outskirts of town, timestamped just 30 minutes before the attack. Danielle had no idea if it was relevant, but right now, it was her only lead. She pressed down on the accelerator, her mind racing. Whoever these men were, they weren't just criminals. They were hired, and the only person powerful enough to want her silenced? Judge Clarkson. She was sure of it now. The corruption went deeper than she had ever imagined, and Angela was paying the price. 20 minutes later, Danielle pulled into the dimly lit gas station. It was mostly empty, except for a lone clerk sitting behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. Danielle took a deep breath, grabbed the receipt, and walked inside. The clerk barely looked up. Need gas? Danielle shook her head. No, I'm looking for someone. She slid the receipt onto the counter. This was purchased here earlier today. I need to know who bought it. The clerk squinted at the paper, then snorted. Lady, I don't keep track of every customer who walks in. Danielle exhaled. She didn't have time for this. She reached into her jacket and pulled out her investigator's badge. The clerk's eyes widened. Whoa, okay, he scratched his head. I mean, I might remember something. Danielle crossed her arms. Start talking. The man gulped, shifting in his seat. Yeah, a couple of guys came in earlier. Dressed all in black. Looked shady. Paid in cash. Danielle's heart pounded. Did you see what car they were driving? The clerk nodded. Black SUV. Big one. Tinted windows. Danielle's stomach twisted. The same SUV that was following me. She leaned in. Did they say anything? The clerk hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. One of them made a call while they were paying. Said something about taking her to the warehouse. Danielle's pulse spiked. The warehouse, she repeated. Did they say which one? The clerk shrugged. No, but if they're local, it's probably the old shipping warehouse off Highway 9. It's been abandoned for years. Danielle grabbed the receipt and bolted back to her car. She didn't need confirmation. She knew that was where they had taken Angela. She floored the gas pedal. Hold on, Mrs. Rivers. I'm coming. Meanwhile, inside the dark warehouse, Angela Rivers shivered. Her hands were still tied behind her back, her wrists sore from the rope. The air was damp, the scent of rust and gasoline thick in her nose. The man in the ski mask stood by the door, speaking quietly into his phone. Angela listened closely, her heart racing. Yeah, no sign of her yet, the man muttered. But Clarkson wants this finished by morning. Angela's blood ran cold. Clarkson. She had suspected he was involved, but now she knew. He wanted her gone, which meant her only hope was Danielle. She closed her eyes, praying Danielle would find her before it was too late. Because if she didn't, Angela Rivers wouldn't see another sunrise. Danielle's tires screeched as she pulled onto the dirt road leading to the warehouse. The building loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Her hands tightened on the wheel. She had no backup, no weapon. But she did have one advantage. They weren't expecting her. She cut the headlights and parked behind a row of abandoned shipping containers. For a moment, she just sat there, heart pounding, trying to come up with a plan. Then, a movement near the warehouse entrance. Danielle ducked, peering through the windshield. The man in the ski mask stepped outside, scanning the area. He was alone. Danielle's fingers twitched. If she was going to act, it had to be now. She took a deep breath and slipped out of the car. Moving low, Danielle crept through the shadows, her pulse hammering in her ears. The man stood with his back to her, checking his phone. She moved fast. She grabbed a thick metal rod lying on the ground and swung it. Crack! The man grunted and collapsed. Danielle barely took a second to catch her breath. She rushed toward the warehouse door, hard in her throat. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and dust. A single light bulb flickered overhead. Then she saw her. Angela, tied to a chair, eyes wide as she spotted Danielle. Danielle ran forward, fumbling to untie the ropes. Are you okay? Angela nodded frantically. We have to go? Now. Danielle cut through the last of the rope. Angela stumbled to her feet. But before they could take a step, a gun cocked. They both froze. A deep, familiar voice filled the air. Well, well, well. Danielle turned slowly, and her blood ran cold. Judge Clarkson stood in the doorway, a gun in his hand, a smirk on his face. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? Danielle's heart pounded. She had expected corruption, expected intimidation, but she hadn't expected this. Clarkson wasn't just a dirty judge. He was willing to kill to keep his power. And now, staring down the barrel of his gun, Danielle realized this was no longer just about justice. It was about survival. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. The dim light flickered, casting eerie shadows across Judge Clarkson's face. His smirk was chilling, his grip on the gun steady. Angela clutched Danielle's arm, her body trembling. Clarkson took a slow step forward. I have to admit, you impressed me, he said. You lasted longer than most. Danielle forced herself to stay calm. If she panicked, they were dead. She glanced at Angela, then at the heavy crates stacked around the warehouse. If she could just. Clarkson raised the gun slightly. Don't even think about it. Danielle clenched her jaw. You're a judge, Clarkson. You swore to uphold the law. And now you're standing here, ready to kill two innocent women to cover your crimes. Clarkson chuckled. The law? I am the law. His voice was cold, absolute. That badge you're so proud of, he continued. It means nothing. People like me have been running this system long before you got here, and will still be running it when you're gone. Danielle felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone he had destroyed. Jamal Rivers. The countless families torn apart by his corrupt rulings. The innocent people he had sentenced without a second thought. She tightened her fists. You're scared, she said, her voice steady. That's why you're doing this. Clarkson's smirk twitched. You can feel it, can't you? Danielle pressed. Your power's slipping. Everything you built is falling apart. Clarkson's jaw tightened. For the first time, Danielle saw it. Doubt. Fear. He wasn't as invincible as he pretended to be, but he was still dangerous. Clarkson exhaled slowly, gripping the gun tighter. Enough talking. I should have handled you the moment you stepped into my courtroom. Danielle braced herself. Then, a sudden noise from outside. A car engine. Bright headlights flooded through the warehouse windows. Clarkson stiffened. What the? A voice boomed from outside. This is the State Judicial Committee. Drop your weapon and step out with your hands up. Danielle's heart leapt. Whitman. Clarkson spun toward the sound, his gun still raised. Danielle didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, grabbing the nearest crate and shoving it as hard as she could. It crashed into Clarkson's legs. He stumbled, the gun slipping from his grip. Angela kicked it away. Clarkson hit the ground, letting out a furious growl. Before he could recover, the warehouse doors burst open. Armed officers stormed inside. On the ground now, one of them shouted. Clarkson's face twisted in rage. For the first time in his life, he had lost. The officers grabbed him, forcing his hands behind his back. Whitman entered last, his expression unreadable. Danielle locked eyes with him. You're late, she muttered, breathless. Whitman smirked. Figured I'd let you have your fun. Angela let out a weak laugh, tears streaming down her face. It was over. Clarkson was done. The news broke within hours. Judge Robert Clarkson arrested on charges of corruption, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The scandal rocked the city. Dozens of cases were reopened. Jamal Rivers' case was the first. Within a week, he was exonerated and released. Danielle was there when he walked out of prison. Angela ran to him, hugging him so tightly he could barely breathe. Jamal turned to Danielle, eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said. Danielle smiled. "Just live your life. That's all the thanks I need." Months later, Danielle stood in a new courtroom. But this time, she wasn't undercover. She was wearing her attorney's robe, standing before a packed room. Her first case as a prosecutor. Fighting for justice. Clarkson had tried to silence her, tried to scare her, tried to kill her. But he had failed. Because Danielle Turner was never going to stop. Not now. Not ever. Danielle sat in her office, the warm glow of the evening sun casting long shadows across the polished desk. The past few months had been a whirlwind. Press conferences, testimonies, and a flood of new cases pouring onto her desk. Clarkson's trial was coming up, and the world was watching. Every news channel covered the case. Every legal expert had an opinion. But Danielle? She was focused on one thing, justice. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A text from Whitman. "We need to talk. Now." Danielle frowned, grabbing her coat. Whatever it wasn't good. 15 minutes later, she walked into Whitman's office. He was standing by the window, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "What's wrong?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Whitman turned, his expression grim. "We have a problem." Danielle's stomach tightened. "What kind of problem?" Whitman sighed and slid a folder across the desk. She opened it, and her heart stopped. Inside was a list of names. Judges, prosecutors, police officers, all connected to Clarkson, all under suspicion. Danielle's hands tightened around the papers. "This is bigger than just him," she murmured. Whitman nodded. Clarkson wasn't working alone. He was part of a network. Danielle swallowed hard. She had thought taking down Clarkson would be the end of it. But this was just the beginning. She looked up at Whitman. "What do we do?" Whitman's jaw tightened. "We take them all down." Danielle took a deep breath. She had fought too hard to stop now. And if they thought she was done, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Meanwhile, in a cold, gray prison cell, Robert Clarkson sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall. His once pristine suit was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit. His reputation? Destroyed. His power? Gone. But as he sat there, a slow smile crept across his face. Because he knew something Danielle didn't. She had won the battle. But the war? It was far from over. Danielle stood in the courthouse parking lot, gripping the folder of names like a lifeline. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed down on her. Clarkson was just one piece of a much larger machine. A machine that had been running for years, quietly destroying lives while staying hidden in plain sight. She exhaled, steadying herself. If she was going to take this network down, she needed to be smart. Because one thing was certain. They weren't going to go down without a fight. The next morning, Danielle walked into her office to find Whitman already there, flipping through the same list of names. "Most of these people are still in power," he said, shaking his head. "Some of them are even on the committee overseeing Clarkson's trial." Danielle's stomach turned, meaning they could bury this before it ever sees the light of day. Whitman nodded. "Which is why we need airtight evidence before we make a move." Danielle's mind raced. A name at the top of the list caught her attention. Judge Alan Reed. A longtime friend of Clarkson's. A man with even more influence. If Clarkson had taken orders from anyone, it was him. Danielle tapped the name. "Reed. We start with him." Whitman exhaled. "You sure? He's even more dangerous than Clarkson." Danielle's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why we have to take him down first." Later that night, Danielle sat at her kitchen table, sifting through court records. Reed had been presiding over cases for more than 20 years. And the deeper she dug, the worse it got. Hundreds of cases with suspiciously harsh sentences. Deals made behind closed doors. Evidence that had mysteriously disappeared. And then, something that made her blood run cold. A case from 15 years ago. A young black attorney had filed a complaint against Reed, claiming corruption and judicial misconduct. 1 month later, that attorney had been found dead. Ruled an accident. Danielle's fingers trembled as she scrolled through the details. She had no doubt in her mind. Reed had killed to protect his power before, and if she wasn't careful, she could be next. Across town, in a dimly lit office, Judge Alan Reed sat behind a massive mahogany desk. A glass of whiskey rested in his hand, the amber liquid swirling as he read through a file. Danielle Turner. A problem. A threat. Clarkson had warned them about her. And now, she was getting too close. Reed exhaled, setting the file down. Then, he picked up his phone and made a call. She needs to be handled. A pause. Make it look like an accident. Then, he hung up and smiled. Because soon, Danielle Turner would no longer be a problem. Danielle woke with a start. Her apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. But something felt off. She sat up slowly, her senses on high alert. Her laptop was still open on the table, the dim glow of the screen illuminating the case file she had been reviewing before she fell asleep. Then she noticed it. Her front door. It was unlocked. Her pulse spiked. She always locked it. Always. Her mind raced. Had she forgotten? Or had someone else unlocked it? She reached for her phone, her fingers shaking slightly. Then, a soft creak, coming from the hallway outside. Danielle's blood ran cold. Someone's here. She slid out of bed, moving as silently as possible. She grabbed the heavy lamp from her nightstand and positioned herself near the doorway, holding her breath. The floor creaked again, closer this time. Then, a shadow passed beneath the door. Danielle's heart pounded. Think fast. She gripped the lamp tighter in. The door handle turned. Adrenaline took over. She swung the lamp with full force. But before it could make contact, a familiar voice shouted, "Wait, it's me." The lamp stopped inches from Whitman's head. Danielle gasped, stepping back. "What the hell are you doing here?" Whitman held up his hands. "Your door was open. I thought something happened." Danielle's chest heaved. "Something almost happened. I almost knocked you out." Whitman exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I tried calling. You didn't answer." Danielle finally caught her breath. "I was asleep. And why are you even here?" Whitman's face darkened. "Because we have a serious problem." Danielle's stomach twisted. "What now?" Whitman glanced toward the door. "We need to talk somewhere safe." Danielle's skin prickled. If Whitman was this paranoid, then whatever he had discovered was bad. Really bad. 20 minutes later, they sat inside Whitman's car, parked in a secluded lot near the courthouse. Whitman handed Danielle a file. Judge Reed just signed off on the dismissal of 3 corruption cases linked directly to Clarkson. Danielle's stomach dropped. Whitman continued. "Reed's trying to bury everything before it spreads to him." Danielle clenched her jaw. "He knows we're onto him." Whitman nodded grimly. "And that's not all." He slid a second file toward her. Danielle opened it and felt sick. Inside were surveillance photos of her, getting in and out of her car, walking into her office, sitting at a cafe. Someone had been watching her, following her. Danielle's breath hitched. How long have they been doing this? Whitman's face was grim. Long enough. Danielle gripped the folder so tightly her knuckles turned white. She thought taking down Clarkson was the end, but the real fight was just beginning. And now? Now, she was the target. Across town, Judge Alan Reed sat in his office, swirling a glass of whiskey as he listened to a low voice on the phone. "She's getting too close," the voice said. Reed's lips curled into a smile. "Then it's time to take her out." The voice hesitated. "She's got connections. Whitman is watching her." Reed chuckled. "I don't care about Whitman. I want her gone." A pause. Then, a single word. "Understood." The line went dead. Reed leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Danielle Turner thought she had won, but she was about to learn the truth. There were some battles you didn't walk away from, and he was going to make sure of it. Danielle felt the weight of the surveillance photos pressing against her lap as she sat in Whitman's car. Her pulse was steady, but she wasn't calm. She was angry. "They're trying to scare me," she muttered. "They think I'll back down." Whitman gave her a hard look. "Danielle, this isn't just intimidation anymore. You're in real danger." She exhaled slowly, then met his eyes. "Good." Whitman blinked. "Good." Danielle's jaw tightened. "If they're scared enough to follow me, then we're getting close." Whitman sighed, rubbing his temples. "You are way too stubborn for your own good." Danielle smirked. "That's what my mother used to say." Whitman didn't laugh. "Listen, we have to be smart about this. Reed isn't just another corrupt judge. He's got power. Connections. If we make one wrong move, He'll bury this before we can get him in handcuffs. Danielle nodded. Then we don't give him the chance. Whitman raised a brow. What are you thinking? Danielle leaned forward. We set a trap. The next morning, Danielle walked into the courthouse with her head held high. If Judge Reed was watching her, she wanted him to see her. She made her way to her office, pretending like she hadn't spent the night planning his downfall. Whitman had already set things in motion, an anonymous tip to the federal authorities, a quiet investigation being launched behind the scenes. But they needed something bigger, something undeniable. Danielle sat at her desk and picked up the phone. She dialed Reed's private office line. A pause. Then, Judge Reed speaking. Danielle gripped the phone tightly. We need to talk. Reed chuckled. Do we? Danielle forced herself to sound calm. You and I both know Clarkson wasn't working alone. A long silence. Then, Reed's voice dropped to a near whisper. Be very careful, Miss Turner. Danielle smirked. You too, Your Honor. She hung up. And just like that, the trap was set. That night, Danielle sat in a dimly lit diner, waiting. Whitman had pulled some strings, arranging for their meeting to be watched by a hidden task force. All they needed was for Reed to say something incriminating. Danielle checked her watch. Then, the bell above the diner door chimed. Judge Alan Reed walked in. He was as composed as ever, dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly combed back. But there was something in his eyes. Something cold. He slid into the seat across from Danielle. I don't appreciate being summoned. Danielle stirred her coffee. I figured you'd want to get ahead of things before they get messy. Reed smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And what exactly do you think you know? Danielle leaned in. I know Clarkson wasn't the only corrupt judge in this city. I know you've had cases disappear. I know you are the one pulling the strings. Reed exhaled, as if bored. You have no proof. Danielle's lips curled. Gotcha. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents. Court records. Financial transactions. All linking Reed to Clarkson's illegal rulings. Reed's expression didn't change. But Danielle saw the flicker of something. Panic. She pushed the files toward him. It's over. Reed leaned back, tapping a finger against the table. Then, he chuckled. Danielle frowned. What's so funny? Reed shook his head. You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Turner. Danielle folded her arms. So are you. Reed's smile faded. Then, in a voice so quiet it sent chills down her spine, he said, You think you're untouchable. But people like me? We never lose. Danielle's stomach twisted. But she didn't flinch. You already have. Reed tilted his head. You're very brave. Then he stood up, buttoned his jacket, and leaned down. Let's see how brave you are when you're dead. Danielle's breath caught. Then, a voice behind him. Judge Alan Reed. You are under arrest. Reed stiffened. Danielle smirked. Whitman and a team of federal agents stood at the entrance of the diner, their guns drawn. Reed's face twisted in rage. You set me up. Danielle leaned back in her chair. Took you long enough to figure that out. An officer stepped forward, cuffing Reed's hands behind his back. For the first time, his mask of control slipped. Panic. Rage. Defeat. Danielle stood, looking him dead in the eye. You were right about one thing. Reed narrowed his gaze. Danielle smiled. People like me never lose. The next morning, every news station in the country carried the same headline. Judge Alan Reed arrested. Massive corruption ring exposed. Dozens of cases were reopened. More arrests followed. The system that had protected men like Clarkson and Reed for decades was finally crumbling. Danielle stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters scrambled for interviews. Whitman walked up beside her. We did it. Danielle exhaled. No, we're doing it. Whitman smirked. You really don't quit, do you? Danielle smiled. Not when there's still work to do. And as the sun rose over the city, she knew. This was only the beginning. Justice wasn't just about winning one case. It was about changing the system. And she wasn't stopping until that happened. Danielle stood in front of the courthouse steps, the weight of the last year pressing down on her shoulders. She had fought battles she never thought she'd win. She had exposed corruption at the highest level. She had almost died for this. But now, looking at the reporters swarming outside, the flashing cameras, the headlines screaming, "Justice wins," she knew it had all been worth it. Beside her, Whitman crossed his arms, watching the scene unfold. You did it, he murmured. Danielle let out a breath. We did it. Whitman smirked. Don't get all sentimental now. You still have about 100 cases waiting on your desk. Danielle chuckled. Good. I'd hate to be bored. The crowd erupted as news broke of even more arrests. The corruption network had fallen apart like a house of cards. Judges, police officers, even politicians. None of them were safe anymore. Justice had finally caught up to them. And at the center of it all, Danielle Turner. She had started as an undercover investigator, walking into Clarkson's courtroom to catch one corrupt judge. Now, she was a symbol of something much bigger. A movement. A revolution. And she wasn't stopping. Not until every victim of this broken system got the justice they deserved. Later that evening, Danielle sat in her office, the city lights glowing outside her window. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the framed news article on her desk. The woman who brought down a corrupt empire. She exhaled. She had won. But there was still so much work to do. Her phone buzzed. A new case. A new fight. Danielle smiled, rolling up her sleeves. Because no matter how hard the system fought back, she would always be there to fight harder. For the truth. For justice. For the people who had been silenced for too long. And as she picked up the phone, ready to take on whatever came next, she knew, without a doubt, this was just the beginning.